Good evening. I'm going to share some thoughts with you that I used in some studies we had in Utica at Hillcrest with some young people studies that we had a couple of months ago. And it's about truth. It's about the concept of truth and what does it mean for something to be true. Is there anything that's true? Specifically, the ideas of objective truth versus subjective truth. Now, I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about when I say the difference between subjective and objective truth. Some of you might not be exactly sure on that. We'll explain that in a moment. But as obvious as it seems, there are questions about what does it mean for something to be true and whether that's attainable or not. I'm going to turn to John chapter 18. This actually will be the only passage we look at for a few minutes. I'm going to spend longer than usual after this passage, just kind of looking at the way the world looks at truth, and then we'll come back to Scripture after we've covered that. But in John chapter 18, this is the occasion when Jesus is being tried before Pontius Pilate, just before his crucifixion. And beginning in John 18:33, Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The Jews had told him he needed to have Jesus executed because, there's one king, Caesar, and here's another man, Jesus, claiming to be king. So Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Verse 34, Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not," wait a second there. Jesus begins, "My kingdom." Well, that kind of goes a long way toward answering that question, whether he was a king or not, when he says, "My kingdom." At any rate, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Pilate therefore said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" I'm not sure exactly what Pilate meant here when he asks, "What is truth?" He may have simply meant, it's so hard to find truth. You have people say this and people say that, and it's just hard to know, which thing is right. He might have meant that, or he might have meant, nothing's really true. Now, I suspect that Pilate was not such a modernist as to question the existence of truth. I suspect that he realizes some things are true and some things are not true. So maybe he's just saying, well, I don't know what's true. What is the truth of this? Can we figure it out even? But that's Pontius Pilate questioning what was true. More recently, if we look at the 1800s, there was a philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who I remember doing a school report on, like in middle school or sometime. My teacher should not have given me a great grade on that. I don't remember what kind of grade I got, but I certainly didn't understand much of Nietzsche at the time. I understand a little more now. Nietzsche worked on the idea and advocated the idea that there is no real truth in anything. That there's nothing that is absolutely true, nothing that is objectively true, only subjective interpretations based on your own perspective about whatever is being discussed. That nothing is absolutely, objectively true. So let's talk for a moment about what is it to say objective and subjective. Some things are subjective. They are subject to your own preferences. They're subject to your own prejudices. They're subject to your experience and how you think of things. For example, what's the most beautiful thing in the sky? Some people might say a sunset. A sunset is beautiful, right? And they might say, well, that's the most beautiful thing. Other people might say, oh, no, it's the stars in the night sky and the Milky Way when you get out from the city lights far enough and you can see the Milky Way stretched across the sky. That's the most beautiful thing. My answer would be the solar eclipse that we've had twice in recent years, one in 2017 and one just last year. I think that was just incredibly beautiful. I would say that's the most beautiful thing in the sky. Which one's right? It depends on you. It depends on what you like. It depends on your experience with those things. So that is a subjective kind of thing. It's subject to what you like. There's really no way to answer what is objectively the most beautiful thing. Because beauty, well, as we say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It depends on you. It's subject to you. So that's a subjective kind of thing. But other things are objective. For example, we'll talk about chocolate ice cream for a moment. And actually, let's stay on the idea of subjective. What's the best flavor of ice cream? Some of you might say chocolate. I would not. I like chocolate ice cream, but strawberry is far better. That's subjective. But as far as what's in chocolate ice cream, I'll make a statement. Cocoa is an ingredient of chocolate ice cream. That's not subjective. That's not just my opinion. That's not just, how I feel about things, how somebody else feels about things. If there's no cocoa in it, it's not chocolate ice cream. Cocoa is an ingredient of chocolate ice cream. That's an objective truth. That is an absolute truth. Somebody might say, well, you can make something else that kind of tastes like cocoa. Well, then it's not chocolate. Objectively, cocoa is an ingredient of chocolate ice cream. And we can look at, I think I've, right. Yeah, I turned my paper over and got confused there for a second. So some things are objective and some things are subjective. God is real. God exists. Now, whether that's true or not, it's an objective thing to be answered. Either he does or he doesn't. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. That's not a thing like which do you think is the most beautiful thing in the sky or what's your favorite ice cream flavor. It's he either is or he isn't. Christ lived and died for our sins and rose again. That's an objective matter. It's not subject to whether you like to think that Jesus was in this world or whether you like to think that he was a myth. It's objective. It's not subject to you. Those things are objective matters, and of course we believe those things are objective facts, that they did happen. God is real. Christ did live in this world and die and rise again. And taking innocent life is wrong. That is an objective fact because we believe God is real. Well, it's not because we believe it, it's because he is. God is real. He has said taking innocent life is wrong. Therefore, it's wrong. There's no subjective, well, how do I feel about that? It doesn't matter how we feel about that. Taking innocent life is wrong. Sex outside of marriage is wrong. You should love your neighbor. Judgment will come. All those things are objective things. Those are not subjective, depending on your culture and your perspective. It's just like secular events of history. Last year, now if I'm going to make a big point about this being objective fact. Yeah, that was last year. Trump was shot. And, he survived it, but that's an objective fact. That's an event that happened. Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. That's an objective fact. That's a thing that happened. We have evidence. We have historical records. We have witnesses. We have every reason to say that is an objective fact. 1620, the Mayflower came over from England and landed on the American shores. You can go all the way back to the 4th century in 300 that Constantine was leader of the Roman Empire. That's an objective fact. It's not subject to your feelings about whether you want to think Constantine was emperor of the Roman Empire. And in the 1st century AD, Jesus lived and was crucified and rose from the dead. Those are all objective things. They're not subject to our feelings about them. And so in Luke chapter 1, when Luke writes his gospel about the life of Jesus, we can see that Luke is certainly approaching this subject from the perspective of a person who believes that events are real. They either happened or they didn't happen. And they happened like this or they didn't happen like that. And we see that in the way he writes. He's not writing about once upon a time in a land far away that nobody can ever trace down to see where it was exactly. It's not a myth that he writes about. Luke chapter 1, the first 4 verses, he writes this to Theophilus. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. Luke is not approaching this like, oh, it might have happened, it might not have happened. I like to think it happened, so I live that way, but you might like to think it didn't happen, you might live different. No, he's talking about facts, real events, just like all these other events we looked at in history. Abe Lincoln, the Mayflower, Constantine, all of those things are things that happen. And we have these letters of the New Testament, and they are presenting factual information to us. It's objective, it's not subjective. We have Paul in Acts chapter 17 when he's preaching in Antioch, not in Thessalonica, correct myself there. Acts chapter 17, he's in Thessalonica, and we read his approach to talking to people about Jesus. Verses 1 through 4. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. Paul was not presenting a myth or a legend to them. He was giving evidence. He was explaining. He was reasoning with them so that they could accept that this was a real event. Factual events. Objective history. Objective things that happened that Paul is telling them about. Now, there was opposition in Thessalonica. Not everybody accepted that that was true. They denied that it was true. And they persecuted Paul, and they got him run out of the city. And we read about those people, that opposition, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, when Paul writes a letter back to this church in Thessalonica. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10, Paul is talking about one who deceives people who would serve God. We read in verse 10, with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, so as to be saved. For this reason God will send upon them a deluding, a deceiving influence, so that they might believe what is false. There were people who would refuse to accept the objective truth about Jesus. And if they're just unwilling to accept it, God will give them something else to cling to. I think we can maybe compare something like the theory of evolution to that today. Now, I'm not saying that I'm certain that that's why the theory of evolution exists, but I can see it being so. That if people aren't going to serve God, they'll give them something else to cling on to. And why is that? Why would they believe that rather than the truth? Which verse was it? Verse 10, because they didn't have a love of truth within them. They weren't the kind of people who just wanted, tell me what's true, show me the evidence, and I'll believe it. I'll put it in my life. I'll follow whatever is actually objectively true. They weren't that kind of people. They didn't love truth. And so they didn't accept the gospel, and they would cling to anything else they could. Do you care about truth? That's important for us. I want to talk about some examples of this subjectivism and how that takes us away from just rationality. Or this philosophy that Nietzsche talked about, that there's nothing absolutely true. Everything's subjective to your preferences and your prejudices. That philosophy has taken large parts of our society to weird ends. If you think back to the Native American, the Indian populations of North and South America in the years before the Mayflower came over, for example. We read about the Aztecs, we read about the Incas in Central America and Mexico. They would sacrifice people to their gods. The Aztecs would sacrifice captives that would, they raided some other people and they take some captives and they would sacrifice those people to the gods. The Incas would sacrifice their own children to the gods. Give birth to a child, you're raising a child, parents, children, and they would take one of those children and sacrifice it to the gods. I remember the president of Florida College talking about these kinds of things and people's approach to truth. He mentioned a fourth grade textbook he had become aware of, a fourth grade social studies textbook, and in the section on the Incas who sacrificed their children to the gods, that fourth grade textbook told fourth graders, we can't look back and say that that was wrong, because that's their culture. And so what's right and wrong for them might be different than what's right and wrong for us. That's Nietzsche's idea, that truth is just subjective to whatever, culture you're in. It's okay for them to sacrifice their children. That's horrendous. But that's what this idea that there is not absolute truth, that truth is subjective, leads to. I'll give you another example. And this is a story told me by my uncle. When I was in the Czech Republic, my aunt and uncle also lived in the Czech Republic and were working in the city of Prague. I was in a different city. They were in the city of Prague, and my Uncle Jim had presented a public lecture that the church there had advertised. There was a man who came to that lecture and then came to Jim's house to talk with him further about things. And Jim had presented views about God, he had presented views about the Bible, and this man who came to talk with him denied every one of the points that my uncle was making. And he said, well, what's true for you isn't necessarily true for me. You've heard people talk about my truth and your truth. And, well, that's just your truth, but my truth, there's not separate truths depending on who we are. Something happened or it didn't happen, and it doesn't matter what I think about whether it happened or not. It matters whether it happened. But he had this philosophy that what's true for you isn't true for me. He said there's no objective truth, only subjective truths. He said we all create our own reality. Among other things, he said that he believed in reincarnation, that after we die, we can come back. We might come back as people. We might come back as an animal. We might even come back as a plant. And he said, yeah, that's why I'm a vegetarian, because I don't want to be eating my ancestor. And my uncle said, well, you just said that we also might come back as a plant. So do you not eat plants, vegetables? And he said, well, no. When I eat, say, corn, for example, I'm not killing the plant. I'm just taking something from the plant. He hasn't seen corn harvested around here. But he said, eating corn doesn't require the killing of the plant. And my uncle said, well, what about carrots? Do you eat carrots? That kind of requires the killing of the whole plant. The fella, I don't think if I remember right, he didn't have a real good answer to that. But again, back to his idea that there's no absolute truth. He told my uncle, you can't prove that I exist. It's just an imagined reality. There was another philosopher, I mentioned Nietzsche. There was another philosopher, a French philosopher, named René Descartes. And you've heard his statement, I'm sure. I think, therefore I am. And he was dealing with this issue of, do we exist? Is that a real thing? And he said, well, I'm thinking about it, so I must exist. I think, therefore I am. Now, that makes sense, right? But not to this guy that was studying with my uncle. He says, you can't prove that I exist. You can't prove that I'm here, because we all create our own realities. My uncle, he doesn't like for this to be shared, but oh well, I like the story. He was pretty exasperated with this guy at this point. They'd been studying for a long time already this evening, and my uncle just wasn't getting anywhere. So he thought he would get a little more tangible with this guy. And he reached across and punched him in the shoulder. Right there. And the guy kind of did that and then immediately just back to calm. And my uncle said, what's wrong? And the guy said, I had a feeling as if someone had hit me. Because he's trying to deny the reality of what is clear, because he's trying to defend the view that, oh, we all create our own realities, you can't prove I'm even here. They talked a little longer. I think, at this point it was maybe over 2 hours of discussion, and my uncle just wasn't getting anywhere, and it was time for the guy to go. The living room that they had in the place where my aunt and uncle were staying just had one way in and one way out of the living room where they were studying. Now, we often have, you can come in and go out a different way from the living room. There's just one doorway into the living room in this place. And my uncle, it was time for him to go, and my uncle says, okay, well, thank you for coming. And he went over, where's the doorway? I'll step over here for a moment. I might not be in the camera, but bear with me. My uncle kind of walks to the doorway of the living room and turns around and faces the guy. Says, well, it's good for you to come, and maybe we can talk another time. And just stands in the doorway. Won't move. And the guy he's like, well, I need to go. And my uncle goes, okay, all right, see you later. And just stands in the doorway. And I don't remember if he asked the guy what's wrong or, why won't you leave? I don't remember exactly how that part of the conversation went. But the guy had been saying we all create our own reality. So my uncle says, well, if you can create your own reality, my reality is that there's a doorway here, but you can create a reality where there's a doorway 4 feet off to the side and go through that doorway. Of course, the guy couldn't do that because we can't create our own realities. What we experience in this world, it happens or it doesn't happen. It's not subjective to anything. It happens or it doesn't happen. And Jesus lived or he didn't live. And he died on a cross or he didn't die on a cross. It's not subjective. And if he lived and died on a cross, and if he's the Son of God, and he rose from the grave, and he teaches us, don't kill your children, then it's wrong to kill your children, whether you live in this society or that society. Truth is not subjective. It is objective. Come back to our question, do you care about truth? And I know you all do. We care about what's true. We care about what's real, because things are real. And we need to follow what's true and real and learn it fully and learn it well. In Psalm 119, Psalm 119, verse 160, isn't that long song. The sum of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous ordinances is everlasting. God is the author of the Bible, or he's not. If he is, then what he says is true. And the sum of his word is truth. And that's what we need to follow. Can we understand it? Or are we like Pilate? Oh, what is truth? I have a hard time figuring out what is truth. In Ephesians chapter 3, in this letter, Paul writes about a certain mystery. Ephesians chapter 3. Actually, I'll kind of refer back to chapter 2, where Paul is talking about Jesus, about the Lord destroying the wall of partition that divided Jews from Gentiles. And that he's brought those people into one group in the church, so that they're not separate anymore. We can all be one in Christ. That's the mystery that Paul mentions here in Ephesians chapter 2 and chapter 3, because God did not reveal prior to the coming of Jesus or he had not revealed it thoroughly before the coming of Jesus, that all these peoples would be brought together into one. So Paul talks about this mystery that has already been revealed at this point, and he says to his audience in chapter 3, verses 3 through 5, that by revelation there was made known to me the mystery, as I wrote before, in brief. And by referring to this, when you read, you can understand my insights into the mystery of Christ, which in other generations was not made known to the sons of men, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit. Yeah, we can find the truth. Events either happened or they didn't happen. If we look at the evidence and decide they happened, then we're bound to follow the truth that God reveals to us and to dive into it. As Solomon writes in Proverbs chapter 2, the first 5 verses, Proverbs chapter 2, the first 5 verses of that chapter. My son, if you will receive my sayings and treasure my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding, for if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. We can learn the truth that is before us. Dive into it, follow it, and give yourself to it. In a moment, we're going to have our song of invitation. And number 480, have you counted the cost? There is a cost to serving the Lord, because we have to put his will above our own. But it's an easy cost, man. It's an easy cost, because his will is what is good for us. We may have to have experience some sacrifice. But life is not all about this world. It's with being his child, his son, his daughter, serving him and being with him in eternity. If you have a need to come this evening, would you come as we stand and sing?
There's a line